Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And this week we are covering Sad Cypress, a Poirot novel. Let's just get right into it and talk a little bit about the publication history. Catherine Brobeck.
Sad Cypress was, of course, published by none other than Collins Crime Club in March of 1940 in the UK, and the same year by Dodd Mead in the US. So the title is from, and this is how the book opens. I like it. It's from Twelfth Night. Come away, death, and in sad Cypress let me be laid. Fly away, breath. I am slain by a fair, cruel maid. My shroud of white stuck all with you. Oh, prepare it. My part of death, no one so true did share it.
It's funny, I made a note saying for once I also liked the Shakespeare quote that Christie used because I feel like I've come down hard on her. Remember the Cymbeline quote that ended Appointment with Death? Not a fan. Apparently, Dodd Mead in the U.S. were worried that readers might confuse Cypress with the country Cyprus.
Oh, dear.
Yeah. And Christie suggested I Am Slain, which is also from that same quote as an alternate title. But in the end, they just decided to keep it the same, which I think was a good decision because Sad Cypress is a better title because it's intriguing. And I think it has a melancholic tone to it with the word sad there that works for what this book is. So it's kind of setting the stage well.
Yeah, I like it quite a bit.
I suppose we should
discuss our victims.
Yeah. Catherine, tell us a little bit about her.
Well, our primary victim is Mary Gerard. She's described as a beautiful flower at one point, but she's very young. And she is the daughter of the, lodge keeper at the estate of Hunterbury. She's also a bit of the companion to Mrs. Laura Wellman, who's the very, very wealthy owner of the estate. She gets poisoned with morphine.
She certainly does. And our second victim is aforementioned Mrs. Laura Wellman herself, who first appears to have died previous to Mary Gerard dying as a result of a second stroke, but who is subsequently exhumed. And it is determined that she, too, was poisoned with morphine. Little shout out to Catherine Harkup's A is for Arsenic. This book appears under O is for opium, since morphine is a derivative of opium. And there is a lot of interesting facts to learn about that drug in that book in direct relation to this novel. All right, let's talk about our suspects. Most of the book, interestingly, focuses on just one suspect. And that is our pretty clear main character here in the story, Eleanor Catherine Carlyle, who is the niece of Mrs. Laura Wellman. She, too, is beautiful, but not of the English rose variety. She's a little bit of a darker beauty. She has dark hair. On the surface, though, she seems a bit aloof. She's perhaps a bit cold in manner. And she is in love with Mrs. Wellman's late husband's nephew, Roddy. We'll get to him in a moment. And they are engaged to be married when the book opens. She's also very well educated. She's photographed at art parties. She hangs around with a rather posh set, has beautiful clothes, etc. We've seen this character before, but I don't think we've gotten inside the head of a character of this sort to the extent that we do in this book.
No, and I mean, the reality of Eleanor is that Eleanor is a pretty serious person, actually.
Yes.
A less serious person, perhaps, is Roddy Wellman, the aforementioned nephew of the late Mr. Wellman. So they're like kind of cousins, except not blood related. He's long-faced. He, too, loves the fine things in life, but he is totally broke. He seems to handle things much less well than she does. It's really because he also assumes that he's going to inherit from his aunt, or he will marry Eleanor, and so he'll just share her inheritance.
Yeah, I love the way that he's described as a nervous, irritable, sensitive creature at bay. And at least one other character refers to him as horse-like, that he has a long, sort of horse-like face. It's an interesting way to describe a male character. It's unusual. And then we have Ted Bigland, who's a mechanic in town who has long been enamored of Mary Gerard, as so many people seem to be. Let's talk about a much more important character, Dr. Peter Lord, the freckled, fair-haired young doctor of the village, who tends to Mrs. Wellman after her first and then what seems to be her second stroke.
He is presented pretty much up front as a relatively trustworthy person. Which is a little bit unusual, I would say, for Christie.
For Christie with doctors?
Yeah, a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, Murder of Roger Ackroyd, we can never trust a doctor again.
No.
Especially a country doctor.
Next, we have Nurse Jessie Hopkins. She's a district nurse, and she oversees Mrs. Wellman's day-to-day care. She's solid, middle-aged. She seems incredibly sensible. Her only seeming flaw is that I guess she's like the village gossip monger.
And then we have a second nurse who is Eileen O'Brien, who is very Irish. Mm-hmm. And she is younger than Nurse Hopkins, and she assists in Mrs. Wellman's care and seems to be somewhat bullied by her supervisor, Nurse Hopkins, or at least dominated by her.
Yes.
Nurse O'Brien, though, has a very sunny presence and just an overwhelming sense of good health about her.
Right.
Then we have last, actually, Mrs. Bishop, who is the longtime housekeeper at Hunterbury, and I believe described more than once as a ship at full sail. She moves about with the grandeur of a ship whose sails are just all billowing.
Let's put it this way. She's intimidating even to Poirot.
All right, let's talk about the world as it appears to be, Catherine.
I'm just going to preface this by saying we're doing this slightly out of order to streamline this. But Eleanor and Roddy are engaged. They've been living as though they have already inherited the money. And Eleanor is an orphan and was essentially raised by Aunt Laura. She's been in love with Roddy since they were kids. Both of them actually care quite a bit about Aunt Laura. Yes, they're doing kind of decadent things in the city, but they legitimately care about her. It's just that they have not been down there in like a month, and they know that she's ailing.
Then Eleanor gets an anonymous letter in the post, and it reads, "This is to warn you, I'm naming no names, but there's someone sucking up to your aunt, and if you're not careful, you'll get cut out of everything. Girls are very artful, and old ladies is soft when young ones suck up to them and flatter them. What I say is, you'd best come down and see for yourself what's going on. It's not right. You and the young gentleman should be done out of what's yours, and she's very artful, and the old lady might pop off at any time. Well, wish her."
It's written in like serial killer misspellings.
Yeah, I'm surprised it wasn't pasted out of letters taken from different newspaper headlines. That's pretty much the vibe of this anonymous note. It's certainly a poison pen letter. Roddy and Eleanor assume that the person meant in the letter is Mary Gerard, who is the same age as them and who has long been paid for by Aunt Laura, just in terms of her education. She's now back from her education abroad. So Eleanor and Roddy decide to do two things. First, they burn the letter. And second, they immediately go check on Aunt Laura.
Yeah, so they drive down to Hunterbury, where they see Mary, who they have not seen in years. So she's been off being schooled in Germany.
Blooming into that English rose, apparently.
Apparently, with her golden hair. And Roddy, stupid Roddy falls head over heels in love with her at first sight.
He's just completely powerless.
Yes.
Sigh.
It's like she's Madeline DeSera.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
So Aunt Laura has already had the one stroke, and she's miserable because she hates being coddled and treated like a baby by nurses Hopkins and O'Brien, and she basically just keeps telling anybody who listens that she would just really like to die.
Where's Dr. Kevorkian when you need him, I guess?
Well, right. I mean, Dr. Kevorkian is not Dr. Lord, and he's like, no. No, I won't be doing that. Then she has a second stroke and shortly thereafter dies. But not before what, Kemper?
Not before trying to say something to Eleanor. She wants and trusts Eleanor to make sure that Mary Gerard gets something in her will, and she makes Eleanor promise to call her lawyers and make sure that Mary is taken care of. And Eleanor, of course, promises. When Aunt Laura dies, though, it turns out that she had no will. She died intestate. Apparently, she was just really superstitious, as many people are. Because she died intestate and Eleanor is her sole heir, Eleanor gets everything. But Eleanor holds up her promise, and she sets aside money for Mary, as well as offering money to Roddy. At this point, though, Roddy really only has eyes for Mary, so she just realizes that this isn't working, and she calls off their engagement.
Speaking of Mary and wills, Mary has also been convinced to draft a will by Nurse Hopkins because...
That busybody.
Yeah, because Nurse Hopkins is essentially like, you don't want that to happen. And so she ends up leaving everything to her aunt in New Zealand, Mary Riley, who is her late mother's sister. And I guess
Mary Riley.
I know.
Do you remember that
Yeah,
movie?
Julia Roberts.
Yes. It was so bad.
Yes.
It was kind of like a retelling of Jekyll and Hyde, right?
In the house of Dr. Henry Jekyll,
Good morning, sir.
there lived a chambermaid named Mary Riley.
Yeah, oh, yeah. Terrible movie.
She suspects the truth.
Anywho,
Eleanor also makes a will, and she ends up leaving everything to Roddy, regardless of the engagement, because she thinks that Aunt Laura would have left him a decent chunk of money. And so she figures if something happens to her, might as well go to him.
she's quite conscientious. She really does the right thing by Mary Gerard, even though she, for obvious reasons, doesn't want to. And same goes for Roddy. She's not pulling a John Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility, disinheriting her family.
Help them? What do you mean, help them?
No.
It says a lot about who she is.
Right, it does.
So meanwhile, down at Hunterbury, the nurses start speculating about how Laura Wellman, this is Aunt Laura again, had been found holding a framed photograph of a handsome man who was not her husband, and wonder who it could possibly be, until Nurse O'Brien sees the same photograph at the estate of Sir Lewis Rycroft, who was killed in the war, this being the Great War, of course, and who had an insane wife in an insane asylum. Hate when that happens.
Who he can't get divorced from because, as we know from Jane Eyre, you either lock them in an attic or in an insane asylum.
Excuse me, as we know from 3-Act Tragedy, we don't even have to go outside the Christie verse for that one.
True. Eleanor sells Hunterbury apparently at a bargain basement cost, so she goes down there by herself to clean out any sort of personal possessions because the house has been bought furnished. And she runs into Mrs. Bishop, who offers to help, but Eleanor gets kind of weird about it. Eleanor is having, let's just say, a hard time since the Roddy incident. She's not doing super great. She just wants to be alone. Also, at the same time, Mary and Nurse Hopkins are down there because Father Gerard has also died, and Eleanor has told Mary, she's very sorry about his death, but she needs Mary to clean out the lodge because she sold the house. So Hopkins, during this, ends up telling Mary that Gerard wasn't her father. Her mother had been Laura's lady's maid, and supposedly she'd had an affair with a gentleman. Laura convinced Gerard to keep it a secret and marry Eliza, who's Mary's mother.
Meanwhile, while all that's going down, Eleanor has decided to make some picnic sandwiches with potted meats with some pastes.
Yes, some paste.
Doesn't that sound lovely? And we get some ptomaine poisoning jokes. I was so excited. Lots of exclamation points in the margins.
You could almost see it coming, too, because as we said, Eleanor is having a rough time. She's not behaving exactly as normally as she would.
Yeah, she's just being kind of weird, and she makes some ptomaine poisoning jokes in the store that, not surprisingly, don't really go down all that well. She makes the sandwiches, though. She slaps that fish paste between two pieces of bread, puts them on a plate, and because she is polite and just a generally stand-up person, she goes down to the lodge and she invites Nurse Hopkins and Mary Gerard up to the house so that they don't have to go all the way back into town for lunch. And she forgot to buy coffee, so she only has beer or water, but there is a little bit of tea left in and around the kitchen. So Nurse Hopkins offers to go make them tea, which Eleanor politely turns down.
Right. She's good with water.
Just to be clear, Nurse Hopkins made good on her offer to make tea. And even though Eleanor turned it down, Nurse Hopkins herself had tea and Mary Gerard also had tea.
So they eat their fish paste sandwiches, drink their beverages, and Hopkins decides to go into the kitchen. Eleanor can't deal with Mary anymore, so she goes into the kitchen to do the dishes. And Nurse Hopkins is in there. Eleanor notes that she looks ghastly. Nurse Hopkins says, it's so hot in here, it's so hot in here. So they do the dishes alongside each other, and Eleanor notices, because Nurse Hopkins' cuffs are rolled up, that she also has a mark on her wrist that is like a puncture wound. And Hopkins says that, it came from the roses by the lodge. They kind of finish the dishes. They go upstairs to finish going through some of Aunt Laura's belongings. And then when they come back down, they find Mary unconscious. They call Dr. Lord, but by the time Dr. Lord gets there, she's dead.
And Eleanor is arrested for murder because she's jealous.
Why are you so obsessed with me?
Right.
Of Mary Gerard. And since Dr. Lord has been secretly smitten with Eleanor ever since he laid eyes on her, he enlists the aid of Monsieur Poirot, who has been recommended to him by a character that we have not met yet because we haven't covered this short story. It is The Dream, but we will cover it, and perhaps sooner rather than later, since it is referenced in the story. Poirot says, sure, I will help you, but Eleanor may very well be guilty, and I, Monsieur Poirot, seek the truth, and that is what you will get. Just beware of that. So let's talk about the world as it actually is. The one thing that we haven't even gotten to yet is the trial, Eleanor's trial for murder. And the way that it sort of is structured throughout the book is extremely unusual in a Christie novel because we actually open up on the trial. And we're cutting back and forth to and from it throughout the book. And especially the beginning of the book and the end of the book are dominated by the trial.
Right. And Eleanor's thoughts, too.
And Eleanor's thoughts, yeah, we really are privy to her thoughts. Even though this is third-person narration, we're very much inside her head. It's also very clear from the get-go that this trial is not going well for Eleanor. It seems as if she's going to be convicted and hanged. That hangs over, pun not intended, the entire book. And the one thing that I also just found so striking about this structure is that we also know before we ever even meet her who the victim is.
Right.
We know that Mary Gerard is the one who died. And it's so interesting because all of those descriptions of her as an English rose and blooming and a beauty are tinged by the fact that we know this girl's going to die and die soon.
Right.
And it's really effective and unusual because in a Christie novel, that's not the normal formula. I really appreciated it. I didn't remember that from my initial read, how differently it was structured, but I really thought it was well done.
Right. I agree. And I mean, and we kind of have already touched on this, but her increasingly weird behavior is also connected then to the inner thoughts in the trial. She was a little bit, I would say, gaslit by Roddy in regards to the feelings about Mary because he keeps kind of lying to her about it. And now she's essentially being gaslit during this trial to the point where she's completely lost the ability to know or feel if she didn't actually kill Mary because she thought about it.
Right. Like when she enters her plea, she does ultimately say not guilty, but Dr. Lord, he can tell that she was about to say guilty.
Yeah. They keep saying she poisoned the sandwiches. That was the only thing that it could be. She poisoned the sandwiches. And eventually, when they say it enough times to her, she's like, well, I don't even know anymore. It's not even that she necessarily thinks she's guilty. It's that she's going to say that she's guilty so that it ends.
Right. It's almost as if she's being tortured into just giving the answer that they want. I mean, this is sort of why there's a strong argument for torture not working, because it actually leads to false statements because,
right,
you know, the people who are being tortured just want the process to be over. And then, yeah, I mean, and this is an interesting point. I think on top of all of that, Eleanor has been trained her entire life, in large part by Aunt Laura, and we even saw a little bit of this when Aunt Laura was still alive, that a proper lady doesn't show her feelings because it's not attractive. You can't be too emotional, or you shouldn't show how in love you are. And when she started showing some of that outward emotion in terms of being upset that Roddy was straying from her, like laughing inappropriately or just being moody or not wanting to be around other people, people noticed, and it made it look like she was falling apart or going nuts or something. And now that's being used against her because all of these character witnesses against her are testifying, saying, yeah, she was acting really weird that day.
Yeah, and it was just like, no, the facade, this perfect facade that she was told to keep up from the time she was a child, she can't do it anymore under the stress.
Yeah. So in explicating what's happening in the novel, the trial is really beside the point, but we wanted to pause in the middle of this and just really make it clear how important the trial is to the overall story. And at least in my opinion, how well done it is. It made me think actually about the Mysterious Affair at Styles, because listeners might remember in the original version of Mysterious Affair at Styles, her denouement was in the courtroom,
right,
but it was not very well done. And her editor at the time, not her current editor, said, what? why don't you not do that? You're not a lawyer. This doesn't feel convincing. So, well, let's put this in the drawing room. And the rest was history. But it's interesting that she is coming back to the courtroom now. She's obviously just a much more assured writer. And she pulled it off. This is a novel of a courtroom trial in a lot of ways. And that's something different.
At a minimum, the trial gives it a frame.
An interesting frame. An effective frame.
I totally agree. So, clues. So, Poirot comes into this novel very late. Dr. Lord has gone to him, as we said, and Poirot goes over every detail of what we just explained, right, with Dr. Lord. And then he goes through it again with other people, the other people that we've talked about. And I think this is a critical thing here. Everyone lies to him.
Right. And actually that also, I think, highlights one of the strong points of this novel compared to a lot of other novels. We had a listener. He has a phrase for this issue in a lot of mystery novels, which he called dragging the marsh, which is a reference to the way that a lot of Nio Marsh novels drag in the middle. You are sort of given your mystery, and then the detective comes in, and then the detective has to investigate, which basically involves just going over all of the stuff that you were already told again, and then there's a solution. We've certainly run into that problem in Christie's before. We mentioned 3-Act Tragedy earlier in this episode. That had that problem. There are other novels that have had that problem. This novel does not have that problem because Poirot's investigation and what he's told and what he uncovers is very different from what we're presented with via third-person narration earlier in the story. It does not feel repetitive or redundant.
No, it doesn't at all. Even if the story plot points are redundant, what he's actually seeing and what we, the reader, are seeing from the conversations is something different.
So with that in mind, let's go through some clues. Clue number 1.
A lot of the clues here are things that we've seen before, right? I would say clue number 1 is parentage. Anytime you get somebody in a Christie novel, or I think in any mystery novel, who has mysterious parentage, it's probably going to be a critical factor in solving the mystery, and it's no different here. Obviously, it's already been pointed that this is connected to Lewis Rycroft, but since he's dead and he's not in this story, nor is Mary's mother, it kind of has to be something else. And so we can make a deduction, because I wonder who in this story has a weirdly devoted, almost maternal interest in Mary, and who in this story might beg Eleanor to give Mary something. Gee. Hey, Mrs. Wellman.
The other addendum I would just make to this clue is that it's almost thematic. Eleanor and Aunt Laura have some real talk when Aunt Laura is still alive, and they talk about love. And it's interesting because there's this theme throughout of Eleanor's love for Roddy not really being returned or requited, certainly in the same way, and the sorrow of that. And Eleanor, before this even goes down, asks Aunt Laura, why does love hurt so much? Or should love be a more joyful thing than it seems to be? And Aunt Laura says, to care passionately for another human creature brings always more sorrow than joy. But all the same, Eleanor, one would not be without that experience. Anyone who has never loved has never really lived. And sure, that is a great thesis that draws out the story of Eleanor and Roddy and Mary Gerard, but it's kind of a clue because it's going to Aunt Laura's own story, and she's clearly someone who is also loved, and it doesn't take much to get to, Mary Gerard is obviously her illegitimate daughter.
Right. Not a big leap there.
Yeah, it's not a big leap, but it's drawn out very artfully in the book through both this notion of parentage and just the themes that are running throughout the story. Okay, so clue number 2. If someone leaves a room while food is being prepared, then that should be noted. There may be something going on there. And while both Eleanor and Hopkins leave during the fateful lunch, Hopkins actually leaves twice. And our omniscient third-person narration does not clue us in to what's going on. We only catch up with Hopkins once Eleanor joins her and notes how terrible she looks. So in that we spend the most time away from Hopkins compared to anyone else at that meal, we should be wary of her. That's the deduction.
Clue number 3, only Hopkins and Mary drink the tea that Hopkins prepared, but Hopkins repeatedly offers it to Eleanor, which is a little bit of a weird thing. And we can come back to this when we're nitpicking, because doesn't make sense.
I don't even think we're nitpicking. I think it's a big old beetle in the hair as opposed to a knit. There's a plot hole here.
Yeah, really big plot hole here.
We'll get there. Clue number 4, when we are told someone has a mysterious marking on their hand or otherwise, no matter how glancing that reference may be, we should know that it matters. And if the ladies of St. Mary Mead had anything to say about it, especially Dolly Bantry and her gardening books, we should also know that horticulture matters. The deduction here is that something is definitely up with that puncture mark on Nurse Hopkins's hand and her pale face. She mentions that she scratched herself on the rose just outside of the lodge, and we are told the specific type of rose that was. It was a Zephyrine Druphine rose. We might want to look into that if we don't have the horticultural know-how of Dolly Bantry, who probably instantly would have said, hey, wait a second,
right.
Those roses don't have thorns.
Every rose has its thorn.
And if you are one Monsieur Poirot, maybe you would think, what an odd thing to lie about.
What an odd thing to lie about. And I also just have to note Christie's skill putting this clue in there, because the first time we are told about the puncture mark and Nurse Hopkins says it's from a rose, Eleanor just immediately goes on this reverie about the white and the yellow roses and the War of Roses that she and Roddy used to play when they were kids. And oh, Roddy. And it just immediately goes off on this emotional tangent. And it's such good misdirection.
Right. Clue number 5, this is a big clue. Hopkins gives Poirot the letter that she found in Gerard's stuff in the lodge when she was going through papers. So she tells Poirot. And it says, for Mary to be sent to her after my death. It's Eliza, Mary's mother, telling her sort of a story about the fact that her father is not actually her father.
The implication that Nurse Hopkins seemed to be making is that Gerard's wife wrote this letter to her daughter, and I suppose at some point when her daughter was older wanted Gerard to give it to her, and he just never did. It is very weird if you read the letter carefully that there is this notion that, well, Mary can never find out, but isn't the letter being written to Mary?
Right, to be sent to Mary. Oh, Agatha, man, does she love this trick. It's the two characters named the same trick. We have seen it multiple times before. And where have we seen another Mary in this story?
Mary Riley.
Mary Riley, the aunt in New Zealand.
I would argue that this is a combination of the trick that we saw in Peril at End House, where it was two characters with the same name, although, I mean, they're both Mary, so it's not even as good of a trick as in there. And then also, we did see the trick of a letter seeming to be written to one person, but actually written to another in Lord Edward Dies.
Right.
So she's up to her old tricks here, and they're working. Clue number 6. Beware of people who say over and over again that they just cannot bring up the past. It would be inappropriate to do so, yet keep bringing it up anyway. This would be Nurse Hopkins, because she keeps on, every time she talks to Poirot, or pretty much anyone in the story, she keeps on talking about Mary's past, but then being like, oh, but we shouldn't say anything about it. We shouldn't say anything about it. It's suspicious. So this is another suspicious point here about Nurse Hopkins. And our deduction is maybe she actually really does want people to know what's going on with Mary Gerard and her parentage.
Clue number 7, if you're reading a Christie novel and there is an image of anything, if there's a diagram, if there is a fragment of a letter, in this case, we have a scrap of paper that's part of a label. And so when the police got it, they saw it was for morphine. And it was in Eleanor's house where morphine had gone missing at some point, Nurse Hopkins had said. And so they read this scrap of paper. But if you're looking at the image of it, which the expert at the trial does, you might notice something, which is that the M in morphine is not capitalized. And so the label is the smoking gun. It's not a morphine label.
It's something a little bit harder to get than simple morphine. And at that point, because we are at the end of our clues and we still don't have an obvious murderer, but you can see that we are heading toward Nurse Hopkins being our murderer here. It's funny because this was a book that when I was rereading it, I 100% remembered that Nurse Hopkins did it. And I think it's very easy, once you know that, to pick up the clues, but knowing why she did it is what is difficult and perhaps also points up a weakness in the story, because it's a little little convoluted and ridiculous. We'll get there in just a second. But it's just, I spent 90% of this book saying to myself, okay, I know that Nurse Hopkins did it, but why? Why? What possible reason could she have? So let's talk about a resolution and just skip over a bunch of red herrings, particularly with regards to the men in the story, because they just ultimately don't matter that much to the plot. But both are kind of secretly a little stalkery. Even
Dr. Lord.
Dr. Lord is watching Eleanor from
in the bushes.
A distance in the bushes as she's like making those fish paste sandwiches. Yeah.
Full peeping Tom hiding in the bushes.
The entire resolution pretty much takes place in snippets of dialogue at the trial because Poirot has figured it out. And he has brought the information to the legal team, who then slowly but surely build the case.
And stylistically interesting, I have to say.
So in short, that label that seemed to be for morphine is for apomorphine hydrochloride, which is something that makes you immediately vomit.
It's an emetic. Yeah.
It's an emetic when you take it. If you injected apomorphine into yourself, you would vomit immediately. And what we learn is that Nurse Hopkins did that because in drinking the tea that she also gave to Mary Gerard, she had poisoned herself with morphine in addition to Mary, and that was her way of saving herself, and that's why she looked so ghastly when Eleanor came upon her. I'm a little confused as to why there was no stench of vomit at the time.
I mean, it's pretty strong. So, you would certainly think so. And I mean, I think that you made this point to me, Kemper, that why didn't Mary taste how bad the tea tasted?
And that also was brought up in A is for Arsenic. I can't take credit for having that thought myself. They do note in A is for Arsenic that morphine in tea would be extremely bitter. So maybe Mary had a cold.
Well, maybe Mary was like a chain smoker and had lost her sense of taste.
Right. Oh, also, while we're speaking about Mary, she's the secret love child of Laura Wellman and Sir Lewis Rycroft, but Aunt Laura never wanted her to find out, just to be taken care of. And the only person who knew was her maid, Eliza Riley, because Eliza Riley had also been pregnant at the same time out of wedlock, and she had a stillbirth, but she helped her mistress out by going with her to Scotland so that when Aunt Laura had the baby, Eliza just pretended it was hers, and she kept it. And Eliza told this rather melodramatic story to her sister, Mary Riley. And Mary put two and two together, and it is Mary Riley who came up with the plot to do what, Catherine?
So she decided to befriend Mary Gerard, convince Mary Gerard to write a will, leaving everything to her aunt, who she's never met, then murder Laura before Laura can write a will so that she dies intestate, and then she arranges to spill all the details of the secret so that everyone knows Laura was actually Mary's mother, so then Mary would inherit everything, so then she can kill Mary for the money because who is Mary Riley? It is Jessie Hopkins, who, in addition to all of this lovely stuff, has apparently stolen a dead colleague's identity after she went on the lam from New Zealand for apparently having killed a client and her husband.
Yeah, we learn a little bit about her from a character who is flown in from New Zealand named Amelia Sedley, which is a really random Vanity Fair reference that Christie just threw in. She's got Dickens references peppered throughout. Obviously, she loved Sherlock Holmes. Apparently, she was a Thackeray fan.
Who knew?
Who knew? So the jury comes back with a not guilty verdict for Eleanor, of course. She is free. She goes to Dr. Lord to thank him for saving her by hiring Poirot. And he, a little creepily, takes her to a sanitarium.
Yeah, please get in this car. She says that she wants to get away from people, and he's like, oh, I already know. I booked you a place in a sanitarium.
Yeah, I mean, for anyone who happens to be fresh off of The Woman in White, that is not the most touching ending to this story that Christie could have possibly written. But Poirot, just to make everything crystal clear here, separately tells Dr. Lord that he's an idiot for even worrying that Eleanor is going to go back to Roddy. Since Eleanor is free now, obviously Mary Gerard is dead. Of course, Eleanor is going to marry Dr. Lord instead. Yeah, the last lines of this novel are
really good.
Yeah, they're pretty heartbreaking. Hercule Poirot's voice was very gentle as he said, "Can you not accept facts? She loved Roderick Wellman. What of it? With you, she can be happy." I mean, you know what I put in the margin there. Archie versus Max.
Yeah.
It's just, we've seen this before. We saw it in Murder is Easy, too. It was this idea of liking rather than loving the person that you're with, that being more important.
The lines before that, Dr. Lord saying, she'll never love me like that.
Dr. Lord knows that they're not going to have the great love affair that Eleanor had, at least on her end, with Roddy. But Poirot says, well, who cares? You can be happy together.
It's like heartbreaking in a way, but also maybe true.
It's a bittersweet ending. It is certainly not a happy ending, which is quite in keeping with the story. This is not a sunny, order is restored and hooray, everything is perfect sort of a thing. I mean, this is a story that is shot through with melancholy and sorrow and loss and regret. And it's consistently told and really well told, I think.
Do they actually find Nurse Hopkins?
I know, and Nurse Hopkins is like it's Christie's thing, right? Like, she's so unconcerned about actually capturing the killer. She just cares about what's going to happen to innocent Eleanor. It's a little unclear what exactly happens to her.
Yeah, because Nurse Hopkins escapes during the end of the trial out a back door. And unless I missed something, I don't think that there's any resolution to whether or not she was caught.
No, and it's funny because it's mirrored actually in the adaptation, which we can transition to and talk a little bit about. We've got, of course, our David Suchet adaptation here. It's the only one that's been done of this novel, because one of the biggest changes in that one is that there's this great climactic final scene in which Nurse Hopkins offers poisoned tea to Poirot and thinks that she has successfully poisoned him. And of course she hasn't. He's too smart for her. He sort of like throws the antidote at her. It's not very clear if Nurse Hopkins is actually just about to die or if she is going to be revived and then thrown in jail. It's an interesting ending. The adaptation makes a lot of changes. To this novel. I think it's pretty obvious. I really liked this novel, actually. I liked it for its characters and for its tone, especially, which is not as unusual as people would think for Christie, but somewhat unusual because its plot really does have some major holes, which we'll discuss in a second. But the adaptation messed with the characters and the tone to a certain extent. I still think it was pretty well done. I didn't hate it.
I like the adaptation, but it's not particularly an adaptation of the book in a lot of ways.
Yeah. The whole thing isn't framed the same way in terms of the trial. And there is a little bit of it. We begin with a voiceover from Eleanor and we're inside her head and they make an effort, but it's just not as shot through with Eleanor's thoughts and that melancholy as the novel is by a long stretch.
I think that there's a confusing thing in the adaptation that really threw me, especially from the novel. And it's because Eleanor actually seems like a cool girl, is seen like in a, slinky negligee scandalously in bed with Roddy at the beginning. And she seems very social and she actually seems friendlier in some ways than Mary does. Because part of the way that Eleanor looks guilty in the book is because it looks like she's fallen apart.
They kind of tamped down a lot of the extremity that we get in the novel. Like, Roddy also is played by Rupert Penry Jones, who is extremely dashing and handsome. Yeah. And he's not in the book. And that's part of what is so effective because Roddy works for Eleanor in the book. There is a version of the world in which if he never met Mary Gerard, he really, they would have lived happily ever after. And it's ruined. And he's just such a nervous, sensitive creature that it's over. He can't recover from it. It's more specific than what happens in the adaptation.
Right. And there's also, it's Paul McGann playing Dr. Lord, but, older than Eleanor. And he's not supposed to be that much older than Eleanor, I don't think, in the book. That relationship is a little weirder, too.
I agree. That relationship is weirder. And here's actually the main thing that I think the adaptation did differently, which I didn't like because I thought it was such an interesting element of the novel. Mary Gerard is a total cipher in the novel, especially in that she is the victim from the get-go. She's basically just described by her outward appearance, and we really don't know anything about her. And I find it quite affecting because what I think Christie is doing there is that she didn't even have the opportunity to develop into whoever she would be. She might have been a horrible person. She might not have been. Who even knows? She's just really young, and then she's murdered. And all these other people are imprinting all these things on her, and she's the murder victim. And it's sad, and it's almost eerie. And in the adaptation, I think it's hard to pull that off in an adaptation because you have to have a physical actress playing a specific person. It's Kelly Riley, actually, who I love in a lot of different things, but they take a direction with her. She's kind of the worst in this adaptation.
Yeah, she's really aggressively flirty.
Yeah, she's really flirty, and she's almost a little cheap with wanting to capture Roddy. We should mention that Phyllis Logan plays Nurse Hopkins, or murderer, and she, of course, is Mrs. Hughes on Downton Abbey.
Right.
So appreciated Mrs. Hughes being a murderer. It was interesting how they also made it very clear that Eleanor and Roddy are having sex.
Oh, yeah.
And there's all of these moments, too, when Roddy is talking about, like, oh, well, I guess I'll let you sleep
it's
tonight.
like, ew.
But you seem so tired. I'm just like, oh. But that's the thing. Roddy is awful. Mary is awful. And in the book, they're not. There's at least some ambiguity to it, and that's what makes it even worse. And almost more confusing.
Well, yeah,
in an interesting way.
It makes it. I hate to use this kind of terminology, but in the book, Roddy really seems like kind of a beta male. So it makes his pursuit of Mary almost pathetic, and he's so hurtful to Eleanor, but yet it's done in this pathetic way.
You know why it's more effective? Because it makes you realize that even though Eleanor is just completely in love with this person, he's not even worthy of her.
No.
But it doesn't make her pain any less powerful. It just makes the whole thing that much sadder and more unfortunate.
Right.
And that's so powerful. Like, that's such a powerful emotional through line to this novel. And even though the adaptation doesn't capture it, like we said, it is doing a lot of really good things. I just have to highlight one anecdote that David Suchet had from his book, Poirot and Me, about filming this specific episode. Because apparently they filmed a lot of the exteriors at a hospice that was filled with old people who were fans of the Poirot series. And this was done in season/series 9 in 2003, where even though we're in more somber Poirot, it's obviously very much appropriate for this story. So I did think that worked. He went around and visited all those old people in costume and in character as Poirot. And apparently they were delighted.
I would be delighted.
There also was this interesting moment where Poirot has a dream and Mary's face turns into Laura Wellman's and also a skeleton's, which is like a little bit of a clue because it's like Mary is Laura's daughter, but it's really trippy. It's like very sort of like Vertigo-esque.
Yeah, it is.
In a sort of like throwback retro trippy way. Mark Aldrich talks about this later in the series. They definitely tried to have some more modern direction, sort of like pep it up with a little bit more modernistic touches. And I think that's a good example of that. All right, well, let's talk about our rankings. And we've touched on a lot of these elements already, but just going through them one by one. Plot mechanics, this is where I think we have some holes, and this is where, unusually for Christie, it does not do quite so well, either in terms of plot mechanics or plot credibility. We already talked about the fact that A, the tea would have tasted bitter. B, Nurse Hopkins repeatedly is asking Eleanor, do you want some tea? Do you want some tea? And she says, no, I don't want any tea. In the adaptation, there's a line earlier on in when Eleanor tells Nurse Hopkins, I don't drink tea. And that was a solve because there's no such line in the novel. And yet Nurse Hopkins is risking, by serving this poisoned tea, the fact that Eleanor is going to take her up on it and drink it and die. In which case, Nurse Hopkins is clearly the murderer, so that's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely it is. Even outside of those plot holes, which are pretty big plot holes, we can combine this with plot credibility because... As we do. The contortions in the plot here, Hopkins is Riley. Riley is Hopkins. You know, it's...
Yeah, there's an information dump, right, that happens at the end of this novel. We have to be told that, oh, Nurse Hopkins is actually Mary Riley, and this was Mary Riley's whole plot, and she killed a bunch of people in New Zealand, and then she came here to do this. And I suppose that her motivation was greed, right?
Well, right, of course. It's money. Because she took out an insurance policy on her husband in New Zealand, and the insurance investigators became suspicious.
But it's like, if greed is your motivation, this is a really risky, convoluted scheme to concoct for some money.
So much of this plan is entirely contingent on luck. It's luck that Mary Gerard's going to want to be her friend. All of it is luck. Every single bit of it. So it's like this psychopath plan, except it's not really a plan because there's no contingencies in any of it.
Right. And actually, our friend John Curran brings this up, too. For him, there's another major plot hole in that whole tea sequence, which is that Eleanor is the one to invite Nurse Hopkins and Mary up from the lodge for sandwiches. And so at that point, Nurse Hopkins had the apomorphine and a hypodermic needle, which I guess maybe she would have had because she's a nurse, but she launched into her plan then pretty much on the fly. How did she know that Eleanor was going to invite them up? And Poirot does mention, later on when he's explaining everything that
she could have been invited them down.
She could have invited them down, or this could have happened at Nurse Hopkins's cottage or something like that. But if that had been the case, I mean, the fact that this all happened at the house that Eleanor still owned and where Eleanor was in charge of the goings-on of this tiny lunch, that went a long way toward the suspicion never really falling on Nurse Hopkins. At her cottage, the suspicion would have fallen on her right away.
Well, right, and also because the misdirect, right, is the sandwiches.
Right. So if the sandwiches had been prepared by Nurse Hopkins, then Nurse Hopkins would have still been the main suspect. So it just doesn't make sense. And
at all.
At all. We just finished And Then There Were None, right? Part of the beauty of And Then There Were None is that the motivation is this person's crazy.
Right.
This person's crazy. So automatically the convolutions that the murderer went through to pull it off are believable. Credibility is fine because they're crazy. That's worked into the plot. Fine. But here, she's merely greedy. And I guess, sure, the fact that she's killed other people, is it greed at that point? Is there some sort of a psychopathy or bloodlust going on?
Yeah,
perhaps.
Probably.
I guess probably, but it's just not a very good plan. And it's not. So the mechanics of it are faulty. And it feels as if these are loose threads that Christie just didn't think about necessarily.
None of it makes any sense from, if you were going to kill somebody for money standpoint.
I think I would do a 5 on plot mechanics, and I had initially said a 7 on plot credibility, but that's way too high after having this conversation.
Yes.
I think a 5 and a 6. How do you feel about that?
I would switch them, though. I mean, I'd rather give the 6 to the mechanics and a 5 to the credibility.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. The convolutions of that information dump at the end go mainly toward credibility. And then we have those couple of holes, but otherwise it is functioning. And she, as we've noted, she does lay in those clues very well. So 6 for plot mechanics, 5 for plot credibility.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about series characters, which is obviously just Monsieur Poirot here. I have one tidbit that I actually got from David Suchet and then subsequently from other secondary sources, but this was in his book Poirot and Me, and it's not about his performance. It's about Christie herself, because apparently Christie had major reservations about Poirot being in this novel. And she decided a quarter of a century later that he was the problem, the reason why this novel doesn't quite work. And here's what she said in 1965. It could have been good, but it was quite ruined by having Poirot in it. I always thought something was wrong with it, but didn't discover what until I read it again sometime after. Janet Morgan actually also has some evidence for this, that she was basically forced by her American publishers to keep on inserting Poirot into these novels because the American public liked him so much. And they paid her so much, and especially in their serialization rights, that she just did it. And she wrote to her agent at the time saying, Poirot is rather insufferable. Most public men are who have lived too long, but none of them like retiring, so I am afraid Poirot won't either. Certainly not while he is my chief source of income.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you, before I even read any of that, I felt like this was another book in which Poirot was a little light, not only in terms of appearing late, but whenever he's on the page. We've talked about this before, how in the first-person Hastings books, that's when Poirot really shines, and we get a lot more of the Belgianisms and just his little character traits. We certainly have some of that here. We have him quoting Wordsworth. That's definitely come up before. I feel like most people don't acknowledge that he is a Wordsworth fan. I love that that is a consistent trait of his. He even says, I do not approve of murder, which at this point is basically his catchphrase.
Right.
So it's not a bad Poirot novel, but it does feel a little half-hearted to me. And I was thinking about it and I was like, this novel probably would actually be really interesting without Poirot, because then it would be even more of an actual novel about a courtroom case, you know?
Yeah, although I will tell you that I mentioned this earlier, that I actually like how the denouement works. It's fractured courtroom scenes at the end. And that only functionally works because we are following along with what Poirot is doing, and Poirot is giving ultimately all of the information from what he's been figuring out to the defense team. That doesn't work unless Poirot has done the investigation. I mean, you could have another character do that and have the same thing happen, but I don't think Poirot is the problem with this book.
I agree with you. I think the way that it's sequenced and structured is brilliant, and I wouldn't want to change that. But I think it's almost like Poirot is distracting from what makes this book really good. I don't think Poirot is the problem with this book, because I think, other than for those plot areas that we already discussed, I think this book is 100% working. I just don't think he necessarily adds anything to it, and he perhaps distracts from the best elements of it. I think that's what Christie meant. Just put in a regular old detective or Superintendent Battle. I don't know.
Well, I mean, you could even have had Dr. Lord do his own version of an investigation.
And been a little bit more of a meaty character.
Right.
You know, make that ending maybe a little less depressing, although it being depressing isn't the worst thing either. I came out on a 5. I think you were a little bit higher.
I mean, I would have probably given it like a 6. I don't think higher than that, though.
We could do a 6. And then book-specific characters, pretty clearly, we both really loved Eleanor.
Yeah.
There's a lot to think about there. There's a lot to identify with.
Yeah.
I talked about Mary Gerard being a cipher, but in a good way. I actually thought that what she did with that character was really interesting, and an oblique way of making her innocent victim point, where the worst thing about murder is the fact that it cuts someone's life short and it doesn't allow the innocent to live their lives.
Right.
She kind of made that point without stating it too strongly.
Aunt Laura is actually a good character, too.
She is.
Dr. Lord is not fleshed out enough, and unfortunately, because he, in the second half of the book, is a main character, it makes it a little bit difficult. That is a problem to me. I think Mrs. Bishop is kind of interesting in her brief little bits.
She certainly is a presence.
The other problem, I guess, is that I don't have that strong of opinion on Hopkins.
Nurse Hopkins is a weak link, I think, character-wise, because who she actually is as the murderer is never really there on the page. We just get that information dump at the end, and then she's gone. So the only thing I noted as a favorite character moment for Nurse Hopkins is that when Poirot visits her for the second time, she's described as having her mouth, quote, full of bath bun. But like, that's the fake Nurse Hopkins, you know, like she's playing this role and she's playing it really well, and Christie brings that role to life, but she never really draws back the curtain on her. So it's hard to feel as if you really got a good sense of her when you're done with the novel, and it's a little disappointing.
Yeah.
Oh, the other thing I just wanted to highlight on Eleanor, and this was a point that Laura Thompson made in her biography, is that there's this really apt comparison she made between Eleanor and Jacqueline de Belfort, a Death on the Nile comparison. And she said, Eleanor is a cool, aloof creature who hides her feelings, while Jacqueline de Belfort in Death on the Nile is an impassioned little hot blood. But they are sisters under the skin, hopelessly in love with men who cannot quite return their feelings. And we talked at great length about how strong the characterization was in the love triangle in Death on the Nile. And I would argue it's about as strong, but very differently drawn in this novel.
Right.
I came down on an 8, but given this conversation, I'm thinking maybe a 7?
I would go with a 7. I can't go with an 8.
Okay. And then setting and tone, I think this is where the book really shines, right?
Yep. Eleanor's panic is so palpable. I think that that's impressive. And as we have talked about, structurally, she's doing something different than she's done before here. And I think that it doesn't entirely work. There are some weird sections of it where it's maybe not consistent, but I found it compelling.
I did too. I think we often talk about giving her credit for trying something different, and I think it actually comes off pretty well here. We had that in the ABC Murders, where she was trying something different. Didn't work totally, but it was interesting, and even Appointment with Death. But I think she pulls it off here better than in either of those two novels, which isn't necessarily to say I think that this novel is better overall than either of those two novels. I already made the point about all the courtroom scenes, which show so much growth from The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And then she's just got a couple of references that I also appreciated, which goes more to setting. But Ted Bigland, who we haven't really talked about, he is described as tanned. By the way, he does have a tan face, so we know that he's very handsome. And that was Mary's former main squeeze before she got all high and mighty and educated. But he is asking her to a movie, which is clearly Camille. which came out in 1936, so that makes a lot of sense. But it's not named in the text.
Right.
But you can figure out what she's talking about, which I liked. And then the Poirot scene with Mrs. Bishop. He has to butter her up a little bit to get her to thaw to a foreigner, as he so often does.
Name drops Sandringham.
So he names drops Sandringham and royalty, and then this is what he engages her on, quote, "A really interesting theme, no less than the selection of a suitable future husband for Princess Elizabeth." For a watcher of The Crown, I appreciate it.
I know.
And I'm sure that it really is what people were talking about at that time. That makes a lot of sense.
Sure. I mean, I spent more time than I care to admit on who Prince Harry was going to marry.
Oh, and by the way, there's this reference, and this is an open question to listeners because I honestly can't figure out what Christie's talking about here. So Nurse Hopkins is talking about Mary Gerard, and this is one of the many passages in which she's portrayed as this cipher. And she says, "She wasn't one of these girls who are all SA and IT. She was a quiet girl." And now I know from The Affair of the Bungalow, our Miss Marple story, that SA is sex appeal. But what is IT? It's not information technology.
Maybe it is.
I was honestly trawling Google for initialisms of IT, and the best I could come up with was imagine that, but I don't think that's what it is. We clearly thought the setting and tone was fantastic. So where did you come out on this, Catherine?
I said an 8.
Yeah, I think an 8 is right. And then our last category is going to be really quick, and that is deductions, because I don't have any.
I don't have any either.
The only references are from Eleanor's point of view. She talks about that tall man with the Jewish nose in the prologue, and then the horrible man with the Jewish nose was sitting down, is what she says at the end of the novel. You know, in the scheme of Christie, there are 2 glancing references, and we've seen so much worse. I'm comfortable with 0 deductions.
All right.
That brings us to a grand total of 6 plus 5 plus 6 plus 7 plus 8 minus 0, 32 points, putting Sad Cypress in 10th place. Technically, we are in a tie here with Death on the Nile and 3-Act Tragedy, but Catherine and I have agreed it should go below both of those novels. So our current top 10 is And Then There Were None, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Murder on the Orient Express, Peril at End House, The Murder at the Vicarage, Cards on the Table, Appointment with Death, Death on the Nile, 3-Act Tragedy, and Sad Cypress. And then the next novel after that is The ABC Murders. That feels about right.
I suppose some people will probably have a problem with us having knocked ABC Murders out of the top 10.
Yeah, well, you know, maybe after the John Malkovich, Rupert Grint adaptation comes out,
we can reevaluate.
We're actually coming up on our 2-year anniversary for the podcast, so we will probably be doing a reevaluation of all the rankings we've done in the last year, and I think we have a little bit of rejiggering to do.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, well, that is Sad Cypress. Our next novel, just as a heads up a couple of weeks from now, is our next Poirot, and that is 1-2 Buckle My Shoe. It is a nursery rhyme story and the perhaps dreaded dentist novel among Christie's works. Before then, next week, we will be, of course, covering a short story, The Dream, which we mentioned earlier on this podcast. The Dream has a little bit of a connection to Sad Cypress in that a character featured in that story recommended Monsieur Poirot to Dr. Lord, so we thought this was a good time to cover that one. And of course, we have our David Suchet adaptation of that story. In the meantime, we would love to hear from you, maybe hear your thoughts on Sad Cypress and where it falls among the canon thus far. You can email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find Catherine at Brobcat. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha, and our Instagram handle is at allaboutagatha. And we would really appreciate it if you took a moment to rate and review us. It helps other people find the podcast, and we love hearing from you. And we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.